Until I saw this poor Native American widow, I realized that humanity's so-called spirit of exploration has always been built on bullying the weak. The story takes place in the early 19th century in the American West, where colonizers, in their quest to develop this land, engaged in a bloody and brutal history with the native Indians. The widow before me was a captured slave, auctioned off like merchandise in front of these filthy cowboys. Her face was stunningly beautiful, quickly catching the attention of an older man in his 50s. At the same time, Jacob, who had wandered into the market, heard the commotion outside and walked out of the tent with his companion to see what was happening. The old man immediately offered $100 to buy the girl. This shameful act made the girl feel deeply nauseated. Just when everyone thought the deal was about to be finalized, Jacob stepped forward, perhaps moved by the girl's sorrowful tears. He ignored his friend's persuasion and insisted on intervening in front of the locals. He had only one goal: to give the girl back her freedom. Though the old man approached him aggressively, demanding he back off, Jacob had already made up his mind to challenge this so-called sharpshooter. Soon, a group of people gathered in an open area, marking a 10-step distance as the boundary, and began loading their guns to see who would be faster. After the referee announced the rules, the two men nervously loaded their bullets. It was obvious that the boy's speed could not match the experienced old cowboy. A bullet grazed Jacob's ear, nearly causing a fatal injury. Amid his friend's shouts, he quickly reloaded his weapon, but this shot only hit the old man's canteen. The old cowboy continued firing, instantly wounding Jacob's arm. Believing victory was his, the old man shifted his gaze to the girl. However, unexpectedly, Jacob bravely lifted his rifle with his other arm and fired the last bullet. He then drew a dagger and swiftly charged forward, plunging it deep into the old man's abdomen. After a fierce struggle, the old man breathed his last. The other cowboys present were completely stunned by the young man's courage. Jacob walked through the crowd, with some even taking off their hats to salute him. In the wild American West, only the fittest survive. The scene shifted as Heartwoman, to thank Jacob for saving her life, gave him a Yulin necklace she always carried. Not only that, under the witness of a meteor shower at night, the two of them leaned on each other. In that moment, they pledged their lives to one another. When they returned to the Indian tribe, Jacob married Heartwoman and began living with his family as a member of the Lakota tribe. In the blink of an eye, 7 years passed, and Jacob brought his Indian wife and daughter back to his hometown in Virginia for the first time. But unexpectedly, as they reached their doorstep, a girl pointed a gun at them, signaling them to stop. After some introductions, they learned that this girl was his youngest cousin. Given Jacob's unkempt, rugged cowboy appearance, it was understandable that his cousin didn't recognize him. That evening at dinner, Jacob's mother showed little joy at their family's arrival, because her eldest son had married a Mexican woman, and now the second son had taken an Indian woman as his wife. She felt the purity of their white bloodline was completely lost. However, seeing her daughter-in-law's 8-month pregnant belly, Jacob's mother could no longer say much. Soon, a month passed, and Heartwoman safely gave birth to a baby boy, which made the elderly couple very happy and gradually eased their prejudice against Indians. Yet, when the boy was born without making a sound, the two cousins cynically thought this must be the nature of so-called savages. As time passed, Jacob started working as a blacksmith in his father's shop, but his yearning for the Wild West never faded. One night, he discussed with his wife his desire to return to that mysterious and untamed land. Heartwoman agreed with her husband's wish. On the day they left, Jacob's younger brother defied their mother's objections and decided to join their journey, causing the elderly couple great sorrow, as they didn't know when they would meet again. Just as they set off, cousin Rachel suddenly caught up from behind, followed by two other girls running toward them. They no longer wanted to live such ordinary, uneventful lives, all longing to experience the unknown world beyond. Thus, Jacob, his wife, their two children, his younger brother, and three cousins embarked on a journey full of mystery and danger. In 1837, their journey from Virginia to independence took a full 3 years. They traveled intermittently, working and living along the way before moving forward again. By now, Jacob was a father of 3, and as they reached the Western Plains edge, they encountered a captain recruiting members for a Western expedition. Although the recruiting captain had some reservations, he handed them an application form for the sake of profit. That night, after much deliberation with his family, Jacob decided to join this large expedition and officially embarked on their grand journey. The convoy set out in grand fashion, filled with people chasing dreams of fortune, a British priest who also served as a doctor, security personnel hired by the captain, and many happy families. At first, Everything was pleasant. The beautiful grasslands were a refreshing sight. But as roars echoed from afar, people halted their wagons, their expressions turning grave. A little boy scrambled up a nearby wagon in fear. Even the priest pulled out his rifle. The deafening rumble was caused by thousands of wild buffalo, each weighing a ton, charging at 60 kilometers per hour. The sheer grandeur of the scene was beyond anyone's imagination, their first real taste of the wild American West. However, gunshots soon shattered the mesmerizing atmosphere. Survival demanded they hunt for food along their long journey. Though some women felt compassion, they would soon learn what it meant to do anything to survive when food ran scarce. Suddenly, the sound of animals approaching returned. The scent of blood had attracted a pack of wolves, with vultures circling in the sky. Such scenes of fierce competition for food filled Heartwoman with a sense of foreboding. Under the security captain's orders, everyone took on their respective tasks. They collected buffalo dung from the grasslands, a vital fuel source for cooking and heating once dried. Women and children actively participated, adding a different kind of charm to the otherwise monotonous journey. As night fell, the explorers arranged their wagons in a circle to fend off wild animal attacks. People gathered in the center, with music and songs creating a warm atmosphere under the dark sky. Meanwhile, two young people couldn't suppress their feelings, secretly developing romantic thoughts. If Cousin Rachel could find love on this journey, it would be a beautiful thing. In another tent, Jacob was called in by his wife, his expression serious. Heartwoman spoke of her ominous premonition after seeing the wolves, hoping her husband would call off this journey, but Jacob paid it no mind, neither believing in so-called spiritual powers nor thinking anyone would heed an Indian woman's words. At 4 a.m. the next day, everyone was awakened by the vanguard. They first had to harness the horses, with breakfast scheduled between 6 and 7, and departure at exactly 7. For pioneers, an unwritten rule was to follow rivers during their journey. When faced with difficult terrain, crossing the river was the only option. For those on horseback, it was manageable, but for wagons, it was a different story. Though the water wasn't deep, the riverbed was strewn with rocks, making wagons prone to tipping. Soon, the priest's family's wagon overturned in the river, prompting security personnel to rush to their aid. Other wagons also began to tilt, plunging the scene into chaos. Worse still, Jacob's brother's wagon hit a bump, causing one cousin to fall into the water. The two brothers immediately jumped into search, but with the water only knee-deep, they couldn't spot her anywhere. Desperately, they shouted her name, but received no response. After a tense search, they finally found her, but she had already lost all signs of life. This heartbreaking moment brought tears to the eyes of the other two cousins, while everyone else felt deep sorrow. Perhaps this was the price of exploration facing the vast, treacherous West. No one knew how many more obstacles lay ahead, and the young girl would now rest forever in this land. Once the priest finished his prayers for Leah, Naomi could no longer endure this life. She lashed out at Jacob, desperate to return to their long-lost hometown. But Jacob ignored her, knowing full well that once they chose this path, they had to see it through to the end. Little did they know, this was merely the beginning of their nightmare. Before the convoy could travel much further, the scouts returned with grim news. Dark clouds loomed ahead, signaling an impending storm. Under the captain's orders, everyone quickly formed a circle, herding the cattle and horses inside, while others sought shelter in wagons or underneath them. At that moment, lightning struck a tree, scaring the horses into a frenzy. They trampled over someone's wagon, flipping it over. Naomi's emotional defenses completely collapsed. She'd had enough of this life. She ran through the storm, begging the heavens to end her suffering. Fortunately, a security guard stopped her in time, but another family wasn't so lucky. Their 8-year-old child was trampled to death by the panicked horses. In the face of natural disasters, humans always seemed so helpless. The next day, everyone worked together to rescue the stranded convoy. The muddy ground made it extremely difficult to free the wagons, and their soaked food supplies were now inedible. The road ahead seemed covered in thorns, making some once passionate young people doubt their original dreams. Ultimately, a boy was buried here, like the girl before him, forever resting in the West. As his mother, she couldn't bear to leave her son alone, even blaming her husband for his so-called pursuit of happiness that led to this tragic outcome. The woman's grievances poured out, voicing her dissatisfaction with their current life. During their argument, a security guard approached and sincerely offered to accompany her whenever she wanted to visit her son's grave. His words moved the couple, and they silently returned to the convoy. Naomi, Jacob's second cousin, developed a fondness for this kind-hearted man, remembering vividly how he had risked his life to save her in the storm. After this incident, the convoy resumed their journey to California. They faced rugged paths, overcoming each challenge together. Perhaps this was what it meant to find joy amid hardship. As the undulating mountains painted a breathtakingly beautiful picture, people often paused to admire the West's unique scenery. In those moments, all the sacrifices seemed worthwhile. Under the priest's prayers at night, Jacob's two cousins found love. With everyone's blessings, they held simple weddings. Perhaps life was just like this: some getting married, others passing away, while new life continued to emerge. This was the cycle of life. The plains brought everyone closer, helping them forget their grief and sorrows. No one could afford more setbacks. They had to keep moving forward, enduring hardships with unwavering determination. This was the relentless spirit essential to human survival. 3 days later, the group was halted by a steep downhill slope blocking their path. Women and children carefully descended using ropes, but driving the wagons down was far more difficult. The men tried using ropes to slowly lower the wagons, but the makeshift supports couldn't bear the weight. In an instant, the structure snapped, sending the wagon hurtling downhill. Someone shouted Rachel's name, but everything happened too suddenly. The violent impact knocked Rachel to the ground, and even worse, her right leg was crushed under the heavy wagon wheel, causing a severe fracture. Given the medical conditions of the time, there was no effective treatment for such injuries, especially in the desolate western plains. Leaving everyone helpless, the convoy resumed their journey, but the bumpy road was unbearable for Rachel, who cried out in pain from time to time. Everyone felt heartbroken seeing her suffer, but there was nothing they could do. That night, Rachel's husband hurried out of the wagon, anxiously telling everyone that his wife was in so much pain she couldn't sleep, and felt as if something was crawling inside her leg. Jacob and the priest rushed to the wagon to check Rachel's condition. The moment they removed the bandages, they saw that the wound had begun to rot, the very situation everyone feared the most. Soon, a group gathered to discuss possible solutions. Rachel's husband hoped the priest could amputate her leg, believing that sacrificing it was the only way to save her life. But Jacob immediately refused. Jacob knew in his heart that amputation would only bring his cousin even more suffering. But after much deliberation, it became clear that amputation was the only way to survive. To stop the bleeding, they tightly tied a cloth around Rachel's thigh. The priest then took out a bottle of sedative, hoping to ease her unbearable pain and calm her during the operation. He drew a knife and carefully cut through the skin tissue on her thigh. Then, he picked up a short saw and began the amputation. Rachel's heart-wrenching screams pierced through everyone present. The priest worked for a full hour and a half before finally severing her leg. But by then, she had already stopped breathing. Rachel was buried in the pure wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, her soul forever resting with nature. This was the second cousin Jacob lost on his journey of exploration. The convoy set off once again, but misfortune soon struck again. A woman suddenly collapsed and died on the road, and the experienced priest immediately diagnosed it as cholera, an extremely contagious disease. He quickly asked the family if the woman had experienced any stomach issues before. The husband had thought it was just a stomachache and hadn't taken it seriously, never expecting it to be the deadly cholera. Once infected, the chances of survival were nearly zero. Cholera was one of the most feared diseases on such journeys, and at the time, people didn't know how it spread. Isolation was the only way to prevent contagion. Unfortunately, Jacob's family had been in contact with the cholera patient. At the captain's request, they had to separate from the main convoy and travel alone at the rear. Jacob's only remaining cousin, Naomi, continued on with the main group, leaving her family behind. As always, fate took unexpected turns, and neither family knew how to face this new crisis. But then, Jacob accidentally discovered his brother vomiting on a hillside, a clear sign that the disease was now threatening his family. Having already lost two cousins on this journey, Jacob ignored his wife's objections and was determined to save his brother's life at all costs. His selfless spirit moved his wife, who vowed to stay by his side, no matter what. That night, Jacob's physically weakened brother urged him to return to his wife and children, not wanting to drag more people down because of him. In truth, Jacob was someone his brother both envied and admired, always full of passion for life and an insatiable thirst for adventure. This was the first time Jacob heard his brother Jethro speak from the heart, wishing he could accompany him through this ordeal. By the next morning, Jacob's wife woke the sleeping brothers. Jethro's condition had improved remarkably, perhaps a blessing from the heavens moved by their brotherly bond. Jacob then set out to find traces of the main convoy, preparing to continue their expedition. However, fate had other plans. Upon reaching their destination, Jacob noticed smoke swirling in the distance, filling him with a sense of foreboding. He circled around to the other side of the hill to see what had happened. The sight before him was horrific. The entire convoy had been slaughtered, bodies scattered everywhere in utter devastation. Jacob walked through the carnage, discovering that everyone in the convoy, including the elderly and children, had been mercilessly killed. He was certain this was the work of nearby Native American tribes. Among the dead, he found his newly wedded brother-in-law's body, but Naomi was nowhere to be seen. It was clear that his cousin had been captured by the Native Americans. A terrible premonition struck Jacob. His own family could be next. Without hesitation, he mounted his horse and rushed back toward the place where his family had sought safety. Sure enough, a group of Native Americans lay in ambush on the hillside, their predatory gaze fixed on the unsuspecting family. Soon, they swooped down, launching a fierce attack. In the nick of time, following his brother's signal, Jacob joined the defense. They couldn't understand why this group, whom they'd never provoked, was so determined to destroy them. Heartwoman explained that it was because of the cholera. The only way to protect their tribe was to eliminate all Western explorers. As the enemy closed in, a brutal battle became inevitable. Though the Native Americans were fierce with their cold weapons, they were at a disadvantage against firearms. However, the slow reloading speed of the muskets greatly reduced their effectiveness. At this critical moment, Jacob leapt from cover and engaged the enemy in close combat. A man who had once hunted brown bears, Jacob's combat experience was formidable. He quickly took down two opponents, leaving Jethro in awe. But soon, an arrow struck Jacob in the back. At that crucial moment, Heartwoman stepped forward, bravely driving away the remaining enemies. Jethro rushed to his brother's side to check his wounds, while Heartwoman, without hesitation, pulled the arrow from her husband's back. Jacob's anguished screams echoed through the entire valley. On the other side, the captured Naomi was brought to the tribe. Because the chief's wife had recently died of cholera, Naomi was forced to take her place and serve the man before her. That night, the tribe's shaman covered Naomi in glistening oils, preparing her for the chief's arrival in her chamber. Once everything was ready, the shaman gathered her belongings and quietly left the tent. Moments later, the chief entered, and without a word, pressed Naomi onto the bed. However, Naomi did not resist. Instead, she began reciting a poem she knew by heart. This strange, rhythmic chant bewildered the man, instantly disturbing his concentration. Curious to understand what was happening, the chief summoned other tribe members, including several elders. One elder believed that Naomi was using a mystical language to communicate with the spirits, marking her as no ordinary woman. Naomi never imagined that a simple rhyming poem could so thoroughly confuse these people. But after living among them for a while, Naomi began to see the chief in a different light, and gradually, she found contentment in her new life. Eventually, she bore the chief a son, whom they named One-Horned Bull. Meanwhile, the few remaining members of the convoy continued their arduous trek across the western plains, but Jacob's injuries were far too severe. He could no longer endure the journey's bumps and hardships. Thus, he made a crucial decision. His wife and brother would press on, while he stayed behind to recover, planning to rejoin them once healed. On the surface, this seemed reasonable, but everyone knew surviving alone in the Wild West was nearly impossible, especially given the severity of Jacob's wounds. Though compared to the torment of the journey, they ultimately respected his choice. And so, they parted ways, not knowing if they would ever see each other again. 2 days later, Jacob was completely immobilized, but fortune smiled on him when his wife's brother, Running Fox, found him. Perhaps this was fate, for there was no other explanation for Running Fox's timely appearance. Over the following week, Running Fox and his tribesmen took turns tending to Jacob's wounds, slowly nursing him back to health. Before parting, Running Fox gifted Jacob a horse, allowing him to chase after his family. However, winter was fast approaching. If he couldn't cross the mountains before the snows, he would have to wait until spring to find his loved ones. But nature had its own plans, as an early winter arrived, burying the only pass in heavy snow. Meanwhile, after a long and grueling journey, Heartwoman and the others finally reached California, the place Jacob had always longed for. Now, they could only hope Jacob would soon find them. During this time, Jacob was often haunted by visions of his children in his dreams, with longing so intense it nearly drove him mad in his solitude. The unpredictable weather and his deteriorating health completely derailed Jacob's plans. Left with no choice, he survived in the wilderness, relying on hunting for sustenance. After enduring a second brutal winter, Jacob burned the grass hut that had once given him warmth, traded some beaver pelts for supplies and a horse, and set off to find his family. Everywhere he went, he asked about them, but there was never any news. It was as if they had vanished without a trace. Around this time, the war between the United States and Mexico erupted, and Jacob was unfortunately conscripted to fight along the border. During a resupply stop at a settlement, Jacob unexpectedly encountered the woman he had longed for day and night. The sight felt surreal, as if from another lifetime. Just as he was about to call out his wife's name, the scene before him shattered all his beautiful fantasies. His wife had built a family with his own younger brother, and they now had a child together. Meanwhile, following orders, the soldiers rested briefly at the settlement, but then, a boy appeared, reigniting Jacob's fading hope. The boy took an apple from his mother and began handing them out to the resting soldiers. When he reached Jacob, that familiar yet unfamiliar face pierced the man's heart. Jacob knew this was his youngest son, but he lacked the courage to reveal himself. Instead, he quietly hung a sacred tribal charm, a gift from Heartwoman, around the boy's neck, then chose to leave silently. He saw before him a happy family, the kind of life everyone dreamed of. Jacob chose to let go, preserving their peace and harmony, while carrying his immense sorrow through the endless journey and the vast mountain ranges. After the army departed, little Jacob returned home, and Heartwoman immediately recognized the charm around her son's neck. After questioning him carefully, she confirmed that the man she loved was still alive, but she couldn't understand why Jacob refused to rejoin their lives. She shared this with her now adult daughter. Upon learning her father was alive, Margaret set out on a journey to find Jacob. Soon after, winter arrived. Heartwoman's home appeared happy and peaceful. Jethro treated Jacob's two sons as if they were his own, and everyone worked hard to maintain this hard-won family. But a passing stranger disrupted their tranquility. The man had lost his way while searching for a supposed mining area, and he told the couple about the gold rush drawing people from all over the world to San Francisco. At first, Jethro didn't believe him, but the stranger's earnestness left him conflicted. That night, Jethro sat by the fire, unable to sleep, the gold digger's words lingering in his mind. As expected, the next morning, under the watchful eyes of his family, Jethro joined other gold seekers heading to San Francisco. Along the way, he was astonished by the scenes near the American River. The riverbed was packed with people, all tirelessly searching for gold. From the riverbanks, excited shouts often echoed. It was clear this place was full of surprises. Jethro looked around, paused, and a dream of sudden wealth quietly took root in his heart. Elsewhere, Margaret arrived at a military camp, searching for her father's whereabouts. The soldiers, seeing a young woman approach, were visibly excited. Soon, an officer falsely claimed Jacob was there and enthusiastically offered to take her to him. This scene was witnessed by a photographer nearby. The officer led Margaret to a dark room, but there was no sign of her father. Clearly, she had been deceived. He then attempted to assault her, but Margaret fought back fiercely and fled. However, the area outside was filled with stables, leaving her with no escape route. The officer, growing more brazen, resumed his assault. At the critical moment, the photographer rushed in, knocking the officer unconscious with a heavy blow. He knew well that the soldiers here were more dangerous than any savages. Without delay, he took Margaret away from the camp. Meanwhile, Jethro had spent a week panning for gold in the icy river, but still found nothing. Just as he was about to give up, a pea-sized nugget suddenly appeared before his eyes. Gazing at the long-desired treasure, all his hard work felt worthwhile in that instant. At night, Jethro returned home, proudly showing his children the fruits of his labor, ignoring Heartwoman's cautious advice as he indulged in dreams of gold rush fortune. From then on, he stopped caring about farm work, devoting himself entirely to panning for gold by the river. Yet, the celebratory shouts of others finding gold never came from him. Despite his efforts, he gained nothing. This slowly began to change his mindset. As winter approached, Heartwoman hoped Jethro would help prepare for the harsh season, but Jethro's obsession with gold made him increasingly sharp in his tone towards Heartwoman. Jacob's eldest son began harboring resentment toward this stepfather. Then came the words that completely enraged Jethro. The angry boy declared, "You are not my father. You have no right to discipline me." Furious, Jethro shouted back, "If you keep talking like that, I'll beat you to death." The atmosphere turned tense in an instant, but Heartwoman stepped in just in time, preventing an explosive confrontation between the two. At that moment, the harmonious family Jacob had longed for seemed on the verge of collapse. Worse still, the following night, Jethro lost his temper over a dinner without meat, accusing his stepson of refusing to hunt or help with household chores. The boy, called Highland Wolf, could no longer endure it and confronted his stepfather head-on. As the conflict was about to erupt, Black Fairy rushed to intervene, only to be accidentally pushed to the ground by Jethro. Seeing his mother bullied, the boy immediately tackled his stepfather. In the scuffle, Jethro slapped his stepson hard across the face. In a shocking turn, the enraged man even drew his musket and aimed it at the mother and son. The once peaceful and harmonious home was now on the brink of disaster. That night, Jacob's eldest son made a life-changing decision. He wanted to be like his father, filled with hope for life and an undying passion for adventure. He took his mother's last remaining savings and left home, embarking on a life of wandering. A few days later, Heartwoman was doing farm work at home as usual. Suddenly, an unexpected guest arrived. Seeing a stranger entering, she quickly grabbed a musket for protection. The man identified himself as David, a relative of Jethro, and asked her to calm down. That evening, the family prepared a hearty dinner to welcome this distant cousin. However, from the man's words, it was clear he wasn't here just for a family visit. He had heard there was a lot of gold in San Francisco, so he quit his blacksmith job and came to seek out his cousin, hoping to chase the dream of getting rich with Jethro. In the days that followed, the two cousins braved the cold, staying by the river to pan for gold. But no matter how hard they worked, they found nothing. Not far away, a few people were dancing with excitement, having struck it rich once again. From that moment, Jethro's envy gradually turned into jealousy. He then brought David to the Chinese miners' area and started beating the long-braided workers. Using such disgraceful and violent means, they drove the Chinese out of the place. With this act, they felt they were one step closer to success. Soon, 3 days passed, and they continued their laborious work by the river as usual. Suddenly, David seemed to spot something in the water and quickly called for his cousin. The two eagerly pulled the object from the river, a massive golden nugget that instantly lit up their eyes. Faced with this unexpected surprise, Jethro couldn't help but be cautious. David, on the other hand, was ecstatic. Worried that others might notice, Jethro hurriedly told David to calm down. If other prospectors found out, they would likely be killed without mercy. They immediately took off their jackets and carefully wrapped the gold nugget. Even so, they could barely contain their excitement. That night, under the dim candlelight, the whole family gathered around to examine the huge nugget. Jethro suggested leaving immediately for the river's upper reaches, asking little Jacob to keep watch while they went to sell the gold at a bank. But the boy was far too young, and Heartwoman quickly rejected the idea. She reminded her husband to remain calm and cautious. However, Jethro's greed had made him impatient. No matter what others said, he was determined to set out that very night. Before leaving, the two cousins had a few drinks, dreaming of their prosperous future. When David asked how Jethro planned to divide the wealth, he was abruptly cut off. Jethro made it clear that David was merely a helper and would only get a quarter of the gold. David was stunned, realizing that after all his hard work, he had been treated like a fool. In a fit of rage, David pulled out a gun, but Jethro had anticipated this and drew his gun as well. The atmosphere instantly grew tense to the extreme. The two cousins, once close, had now turned against each other over gold. To ease the tension, Jethro reluctantly agreed to give David 1/3 of the wealth. Meanwhile, Heartwoman, hearing their argument, was filled with a deep sense of foreboding. Later that night, Jethro was awakened by a cold wind, only to find that both the gold and David were gone. Sensing trouble, he rushed out to search. He finally spotted David trying to escape through the woods. The two cousins faced off with guns drawn once again. Jethro had believed David wouldn't dare harm him, but in the face of greed, all moral boundaries crumbled. Jethro was shot in the leg, yet he gritted his teeth and kept chasing David despite the pain. David ran to the riverside, intending to escape in a canoe he had prepared earlier. But Jethro, without hesitation, jumped into the icy water and grabbed the canoe's rope. Trying to stop him, blinded by greed, David had lost all reason. He grabbed a paddle and violently struck Jethro, hitting him repeatedly. Jethro never imagined that after surviving the harsh West and escaping cholera, he would now lose his life to his own greed. At that moment, David's own foot slipped, and burdened by the heavy gold, he lost his balance on the canoe and fell into the water. He struggled desperately to free himself from his pack, but the gold was tied too tightly. After a brief struggle, David and his treasure sank together into the river's depths. The cousins' battle over gold had finally come to a tragic end. Heartwoman looked at Jethro's lifeless body, feeling that all her previous ominous premonitions had cruelly come true. Time passed, and by 1851, conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans over land had reached an irreconcilable stage. Some officials proposed having Native American chiefs sign a peace treaty, known as the Fort Laramie Treaty. They saw themselves as creators, graciously allocating land to the Native Americans, but in reality, this land had always belonged to the indigenous tribes. The white men's true goal was to ensure the safe passage of their wagons through native territories. On the surface, both sides appeared optimistic about the treaty, but things were far from simple. Soon, a convoy of white settlers traveling through the West camped near a Native American village. At that moment, a large yellow bull suddenly went berserk, ignoring its owner's attempts to restrain it, and charged into the native living area, damaging property and injuring people. The chief, hearing the commotion, quickly stepped out of his tent to investigate. He saw that his tribesmen had already subdued the bull. Despite the damages caused, the Native Americans did not demand compensation, instead asking the white settlers to take the bull back. But for some reason, the white settlers seemed extremely fearful when facing the nomads' polite request. Without saying a word, they hastily rejoined their convoy and fled. This behavior puzzled the entire village. The tribe then gathered to discuss how to handle the bull. An experienced chief walked over, his heart filled with a sense of foreboding. He decided to go to town the next day to discuss the matter with some white leaders. However, plans often failed to keep up with changes. Before the old chief could set out, a group of soldiers stormed into native territory. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the chief quickly led his people to meet them, but events unfolded in an unexpected direction. The leading captain accused the Native Americans of theft, demanding they hand over the so-called cattle thieves. Despite the chief's detailed explanation of the incident and his offer to compensate with 5 horses, the captain remained aggressive. He arrogantly insisted on his demands, speaking in a commanding tone. Seeing the young officer's unreasonable attitude, several native chiefs decided to abandon the negotiations. Infuriated, the captain returned to his troops and ordered them to open fire. The white men broke the Treaty of Equality, betraying their word, and thus began a brutal and inhumane invasion. The Native Americans, who had kept their promises, could no longer remain silent. They took up their bows and arrows, and with hearts full of hatred, rose up against the merciless guns. Soon, a translator was killed by an arrow. The arrogant captain was not spared either. His back was pierced full of holes by native arrows. After a while, the entire army was utterly annihilated. The actions of the white men proved they had no sincere intentions. The previously signed peace treaty had become nothing more than a worthless scrap of paper. Because of this, a bloody and ferocious conflict erupted between the white settlers and the Native Americans. This savage war raged on for 10 long years. Time passed silently, as swiftly as a song fading away. A decade slipped by unnoticed. The man who had served in the army for many years finally returned. His younger brother had been dead for many years as well. Perhaps this was the cruelest of endings, but it forced Jacob to face reality. He tied his horse to a post and, through the snow-covered streets, anxiously searched for his wife. At that time, Hartwoman was running a small restaurant near the mining district, cooking meals for gold prospectors to make a living. Outside the restaurant, Jacob finally spotted that familiar yet slightly unfamiliar figure. 10 long years of waiting, this long-anticipated reunion had been his only reason to keep going. Meanwhile, the nearby gold miners noticed the man's gaze fixed on the woman. Unaware of the situation, they began mocking him, even making vulgar jokes about the woman. Jacob ignored them, instead reaching out and grabbing his ex-wife's hand. Their eyes met, and Hartwoman could no longer suppress her overwhelming emotions. However, a child nearby, not understanding what was happening, thought his mother was being harassed. He rushed forward to intervene, but was quickly pulled aside by one of the gold miners. At that moment, Jacob could no longer endure it. He would not allow anyone to harm his family. The man drew his pistol and aimed it at the 2 insolent thugs. Seeing the man she had longed for return, Hartwoman's eyes filled with hope. Jacob then took the rifle from his wife's hands, raised it to the sky, and fired a shot. The deafening crack silenced everyone around. This act declared to all that his wife would never again suffer any humiliation. This was what it meant to be a true man. Jacob was determined to make up for the 10 years of love he had failed to give her. As long as she remained by his side, he would never allow Hartwoman to suffer another moment of injustice. The legendary Jacob, fearless in the face of hardship and always eager to explore, had finally returned. Time flew by once more, and another 10 years passed in a blink. The nation was now on the brink of division, but for Jacob's family, these 10 years had been a sanctuary for their hearts, a time of unprecedented peace, harmony, and fulfillment. The family lived happily together. On a sunny day, they decided to have a family portrait taken by Margaret's husband. However, one person was missing from the photo: Jacob's eldest son. During dinner, as was his habit, Jacob led the family in prayer before the meal. but his younger son seemed preoccupied with heavy thoughts. As expected, he expressed his desire to leave home. It was the era of the Civil War, with California supporting the Union. Now a grown man, he felt it was time to venture out and make his own way. That night, before his departure, Jacob gave his youngest son a pistol. The boy was puzzled, but his father told him plainly the world was full of danger, and he should never hesitate to use it. Better for others to die than for yourself to be killed. This was the hard-earned wisdom Jacob had gathered from his years of wandering the West. A stark warning to his son. A few days after the younger son left, Margaret and her husband also departed from home. They traveled while supporting themselves through photography, carrying forward their father's adventurous spirit. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.